Hey folks, Rob here, bringing another initial recce. This is a series where we look at a scenario and try and get some first impressions on it. So we're going to examine the SSRs, examine the scenario card, orders of battle, and then we'll finally look at the terrain that we're going to cover. And maybe I can give you guys some tips on what worked for us when we played this and what may not work for us. All right, let's get to it. So this is what we're going to be covering. We're going to be going over the scenario, we're going to be going over the special rules, and we're going to analyze the opposing forces and see how they might fit best and where they have to be set up. And then we're going to get into some terrain analysis using those Akoko factors just to break up the battle space into recognizable terms and areas, and hopefully to help you as a planner figure out some tactics and strategies yourselves before you can sit down at the table and play this scenario. Now, scenario C, the one that we're going to be talking about, the streets of Stalingrad, should really be the bloody streets of Stalingrad because it will be bloody. It's actually a composition of scenario A and B, you can see here. Now, each of those two scenarios uses half of the map board, and C brings them all together and adds an armor. So let's look at the overview of the scenario. Now, as I said before, it takes A and B and combines them with armor, and it reduces the game length to 7 turns. Now, scenario A, which is the guard's counterattack, takes place on the left side of the map. And scenario B takes place on the right side of the map. And again, C combines them both together. Now, A and B each have their own victory conditions, you can see here. The one on the left is A, the one on the right is B. And in essence, the Russians must capture 2 or more buildings initially occupied by the Germans, of which there's 5, then they might lose. So if they lose any of these red ones, they have to gain that many more German ones. And on the right side, the only objective is who controls the factory. And if you control at least 6 hexes, then you're going to be the winner. Any other result is basically going to be a draw. It's also going to be sequential setup. So first of all, these Germans set up in these buildings here. Then these Russians set up in those buildings there. Next up, we have the factory set up for the Russians. And then we have the German forces spread out all around it in a kind of like a ring. And then lastly, we have the 5 to 7 hordes, which are going to be coming in somewhere around there. So this building here, X3, is considered a factory, and therefore there's not going to be any upper floors. Roofs are not in play. And all we have is a vehicle entrance this way, which means the vehicles can enter, pay 1 MP, and you will have to do a bog check because it is a building. However, you don't have to come crashing through the walls with half your movement rate, and then avoid bogging that way either. Any non-prisoner Russians inside the factory are going to be fanatic as well, which is something else that we're going to have to deal with. So looking at scenario archive, this is some stats I pulled off for the 3 scenarios. A has obviously got the most play. I dare say it's probably the most played scenario in the history of Squad Leader. These are only recorded plays, so there's been a lot of plays or not. Now, Germans have a slight edge on scenario A. Personally, I don't see how. Scenario B, the Russians have an overwhelming majority of wins. It's much harder for them because you have that 5 to 7 Carpeted Doom coming in from the west. Now, scenario C is slightly more balanced, is a slight edge to the Russians. Again, because they have that 5 to 7 horde in the middle, that gives them some flexibility. It's quite easy to take both victory conditions for the Russians. So the Germans really have their work cut out for them, but they do have some advantages, which we're all going to cover. Last thing I'll talk about is the scenario itself. It came out originally in the general magazines. This is scenario A, which was one of the first ASL scenarios put out. And it's been since updated, and you can now find all 3 of these scenarios along with several others. They're under classics, and you can download them directly from MMP's website. They've all been updated and have any errata put in them. All right, let's start by looking at the scenario special rules. Easy or moderate with no wind at start, fairly typical for this. So buildings are moderate, which means it's zero modifier for kindling purposes. Should you want to try and burn the place down, it is possible. There's no wind at start, so you're going to be hampered to some degree. I don't think you're going to have time enough to kindle, but you may be able to get one or two buildings off denied terrain to the opposing force that way. You must use the exact orders of battle and setup restrictions, which are quite detailed. If we look at the first one, for example, this is the German setup on the left, scenario A. Each of these little groups has their own building setup, as well as the Russians. So it's very specific on who goes where, and again, who goes first and who doesn't. Now, we set up scenario A before we do scenario B. And then again, each non-prisoner unit in its fanatic in building X3, which is considered a factory. So once more, no roofs or no second and first floors. It's strictly ground level and easier moving around inside. But Russians will be fanatic inside that location. German armor can be delayed one turn. Now, normally, the German armor, which consists of 5 tanks, enters on turn 3 from those 2 hex locations, the 2 blue arrows you can see on the map. If you delay a turn, you can come in anywhere along the south or the east edge. So you do have a lot more flexibility depending on how the battle's going, on whether or not you delay your points, come in better to support the left side, or whether or not you just have to do a wave from the right. Lastly is an SSR that we did not use in the play Dave and I did, but it's very critical, especially for the Germans, to get this. Both players, if they agree, and the game turns out to be a draw, which means somebody gets A, the other person gets B, vice versa, then the Russian loses unless he has a favorable 3-to-1. Now, he already starts off with 1.5 to 1 squad ratio, maybe even a little bit more than that. And he does have the advantage typically of moving first, although because of scenario C's conditions, we actually roll a die to see who goes first. So if the Germans lose, the Russians get the assault advantage, and it's much harder for the Germans to come back from. But we never used this scenario, this SSR, at all in our particular scenario. If we had used it, given the way the battle turned out, because it turned out to be a draw for Dave and I, it probably would have been a loss for the Russians because of that 3-to-1 ratio. At the very end, the Germans don't care about that as long as they've secured a victory. You're just going to try and smash as many Russians down as possible to reduce that ratio. So these are some critical rules to know if you want to have a good chance of playing this. You must understand prisoner rules. There's going to be a lot of... We actually ran out of prisoner counters. There's so many. You have to understand your routing choices and thereby also determine where you place your troops, because they will get cut off. And if they're cut off, they're much easier to reduce failure to rout or just plain old surrender. And again, you have to decide at what point do you put no quarter in play, because... typically the defender can play this a lot more because he doesn't have to worry about controlling buildings as much. It's the assaulting force that has to gain control, and it's a little bit harder for them. But because of the back and forth nature of this scenario, you may want to avoid invoking no quarter as long as possible, because it will help you mop up buildings. And since the game is really about building control, having no quarter in effect might actually hinder that. So you got to know when to apply it and when not to. You also need to know ordnance and vehicles. It's dense urban terrain. There's no rubble and debris to speak of, but the armor is still going to have to be moved discreetly. You're going to have opposing armor, and you're going to have units capable of street fighting, reaction fire, what have you. So you'd want to try and avoid those situations as much as possible. So you really need to know your vehicle rules, when to back up instead of going forward, and of course how guns work. Fire and movement. Now, assault fire is going to be key. So the Germans have it on their 838s, Russians have it on their 628s, and their 527s. So having assault fire capability with the ability to move is obviously a definite benefit. Russians are penalized because they don't have smoke, but except for the vehicles. And the Germans have plenty of squad smoke exponent. Yes, it's 1, but the engineers are 3. So they're able to use their smoke grenades a lot more effectively to move around for cover. And then, of course, there's the Russian special rules. When if you apply a human wave, sometimes there's a benefit. Typically not, but there might be a case where it comes into play, especially at the start, and the commissars and how they work. All right, so with all that said, let's start looking at the unit orders of battle. Now, this is for the Germans first. You have 13 squads in Scenario A, 19 in B, and that includes 6 A38s in Scenario B on the right side, as well as 26 467. So it's going to use up most of your counters. And again, most of them have predetermined setup locations. Scenario B does give you some variability with where you put your units. You have anywhere from 3 to, 4 buildings that you could put your units in, which gives you some flexibility in how you apply it. Again, we'll look into some options. You do have plenty of leaders, which is actually a 1-to-3 ratio. Now, normally, according to the leader generation rules in DYO games, it's more like a 1-to-4, 1 leader for every 4 squads. So you're really overloaded with squads. Every stack pretty well has one. You've also got a lot of weapons, 10 LMGs, 4 mediums, and 2 heavies nonetheless, all on one map. Now, plenty of these weapons are going to be captured by the end of the game. They're going to be switching hands back and forth, and this works on both sides. You'll be capturing Russians, Russians will be capturing Germans, and there will be plenty of abandoned weapons on the field, no doubt. You also got armor in the form of 3 Stug 3Gs, which have the up-armored hull as well as a 75 long, and they do have APCR capability. It is a 6 depletion for 1942, so that's not too bad. You've also got smoke dischargers on the Stug 3Gs as well, and the 3Bs, which you have too. Now, these tanks are slightly less effective. These are more your assault guns used for pounding those positions, and you're going to have 75 short-barreled for that. So some advantages that we've determined. A38s for the Germans are definitely OP. They're just powerful. With flamethrowers and DCs, you're assault firing with an 8 if you're adjacent. So that's pretty good. And then you start stacking 2 or 3 of them together. You're looking at it, the 20s, 24 maybe, and that's after you've moved and assaulted as you're adjacent to the Russian. So it's a very powerful unit. Again, the leaders, you have so many, including a 10-3 and a 10-2. Good for fire bases and leading the assault. You put a 10-3 in with your A38s, and as long as he makes his morale checks, he pretty well negates any modifier to the morale check. As we said, APCR for the Stugs. Depletion number is a 6 for the 75 long, and the Stug 3 only has AP with a depletion of 7, so you're not going to be using that in an anti-armor roll. Typically, the 3Bs are going to be used to blast Russians out of the buildings. Firepower. There's just so much firepower from the Germans. Again, A38s, a lot of weapons, and 26 467s. Not to mention the armor. So you will have a lot of power. There's a lot of open terrain. You will be able to set up plenty of fire lanes that the Russians are going to have to work their way through. Lastly, let's look at smoke grenades and the sniper. So because these guys are A38s, they're not considered assault engineers, so they do not have increased smoke exponent, even though they come from an assault engineer battalion. So they only have a smoke exponent of 3, which is 50-50, not too bad. Remember, if you roll a 6, you're stuck, you're in that place, you can't move. And the normal German squads have a smoke exponent of 1, which is not great. However, with no wind at start and a 1 out of 6 chance, it's not horrible that you may be able to get some smoke off to cover your own movement. And of course, the snipers is 6. Snipers are a huge RNG factor in this game. If you're unlucky, you're going to roll a lot. And every time you roll, there's a chance you may be losing your leaders, breaking squads, and generally ruining your day. It's a huge variable because both sides have a SAN of 6 that it's going to work both ways. And it's the great unknown. You never know what it's going to take out. Now, some disadvantages. that we're going to look at are dispersed setup. That's the biggest hindrance for the Germans. They are spread out everywhere. And you're intermixed with Russians between you and your main forces. So it's going to be very difficult for the Germans to coordinate efforts. Again, barring some fortuitous luck with your dice. The AFE entry turn is a bit of a disadvantage because it comes on turn 3, and you do have the option of delaying till turn 4 to bring on your armor to increase the entrance locations. However, because the Russian armor comes on turn 2, you're going to be already one step behind, and it's going to be that much harder to fight off the armor as well as the assaulting troops, especially on the west board, because the Russian armor comes on there in turn 2, and their 12 firepower attack on the IFT is just deadly. You're outnumbered. As we said, you're 59 Russian squads to about 31, 32 German squads. So you already have a number there almost at 2 to 1, at least 1 to 5, but more likely 2 to 1 outnumbered. And again, that's very hard to root the Russians out of the buildings. And then you have to, of course, survive their fire, and most of them have assault fire coming at you. Scenario A we found very difficult for the Germans because you're dealing with initially 12 628s and a 10-2 that are going to be coming in from that direction. And again, because of your scattered setup with your forces to resist them, it's very difficult to hold them off long enough for your armor to come in and support it, let alone being able to support anything that's happening in on Scenario B. So you cannot support both maps and objectives. You have 2 fights. You're going to have the factory, and you're going to have the Scenario A, the control of the buildings. You have 7 turns to hold the Russians off and deny them their objectives, which means that more than likely you're going to secure the factory, and then you're going to have to make a concerted push from the east to the west, fighting through the Russians to try and take some of their buildings back. Again, because it's only 7 turns, your armor comes on turn 3, maybe turn 4. It's very difficult, I think, for the Germans to do that, again, barring crazy dice rolls. Looking at the Russians, we have a lot of Russians, 59 squads, 21 alone come in Scenario A, and then you have 38 coming in Scenario B. And if you remember the previous slide there, the numbers, again, you're looking at 13 to 21 and then 38 to 19. So in Scenario B, you've outnumbered twice. And your breakdown is going to be 12 628s, 21 447s, and then 26 527s. The carpet of assault fire that's going to be coming both ways, and they'll be able to support both sides of the equation. Your leaders, you're looking at the typical 1-to-8 ratio, which is standard for the leader generation and design your own. What that means is when you look at this scenario, design your own rules. Let me bring that up. What we're talking about here is this column here, LG, that's leader generation. So when you design your own campaign, you tally up your points of squad types, and it's based on normal squads. Elite squads are worth 1.5 times. Lesser squads are worth less. And you total that up, then you divide it by your leader generation number to determine how many leaders you get. Any fractions left over means you basically get an 8-0 tacked onto your orders of battle. Now, Germans have a 4, whereas Russians have an 8, which means for every 8 squads, the Russians get 1 leader, typically on average. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about leaders here. Now, support weapons, again, is based on ratio, but once more, there's a lot of firepower that the Russians have to draw upon, especially in Scenario B. You got a heavy, you got 2 mediums, you got 3 lights, 4 coming on with your 5-7s, and then of course you've got the 1 medium set up on board A. Scenario A. Now, regarding leaders, again, you do have a 10-2 and a 9-2, and you do have the option, because you already have 1 commissar, that you could exchange one of these 8-0s for another 9-0 commissar. Now, commissars have their own advantages and disadvantages. One is it boosts your morale. It's you can ignore desperation morale when you're rolling for rallies. However, when you fail to rally under a commissar, you become ELR'd and or start to get reduced if you're already a conscript squad. So you could, depending on your die rolls, see your 5.27s turn to 4.26s and disappear completely as the commissar is knocking them off one by one. Armor is, again, in the shape of 4. Now you have one M43 and 3 M41s. The M41 is the red movement point numbered tank, which means you have a chance of stalling. The radialist, which means you got to move in the platoon. And generally speaking, these are probably your weaker tanks, including a weaker inferior turret. You have an 8 in the front of the turret. The M43 is probably going to be hunting the German tanks more so, while these 3 are going to help root out any Germans in the buildings. The T-34 M43 does have rate of fire of 1 and a 76 long, and they also have APCR, but it's only a 4. So not that you need it, because the German armor is either going to be 6 or 8, depending where you hit it. So the base kill for a 76 long is going to be a 13, again, not accounting for any range. And if you look at APCR for the 76, you're looking at a 14. So not too bad. You're going to deduct 8 or 6, depending on what you're firing at. Maybe a 3 if you get a rear shot or a side shot. And therefore, it's quite powerful. Not as powerful as the 76 long that the Germans have, or 75 long, excuse me. With APCR, they have a 20, which will kill your T-34s. So some advantages that the Russians have over the Germans, you outnumber them. It's not really 1.5, it's closer to 1.2 almost, again, 59 to 31 in terms of units, and including 12 6.28s and 26 5.27s. Again, these guys have assault fire, which means that they're really going to ruin the day for the Germans as they clear the buildings and sweep them clear. Remember how assault fire works, so you do all your halving and doubling, and then you add 1 for assault fire, and then you round up if it's still a fraction. So your 5.27s are going to be on the 4 from range, 6 if they're adjacent. Your 6.28s will be 4 from range, and 6 if you're adjacent. And that's not counting adding in LMGs and such, of which they're probably going to capture a few German ones. Factory fanaticism, again, the +1 morale is going to be quite good for 7 troops. Maybe if you bring in an 8-0 commissar, they could actually have a 9-4-4-7 morale, which is quite good and going to be really hard for the Germans to whittle that down. You can support either attack with your 5.27s. Again, we're going to get into that and how that looks. You do have a lot of flexibility, so if your Scenario A objective is falling, you can send some 5.27s in to buffer up, and if your factory is starting to fall, you can dedicate all your forces towards that, provided that your other scenario is going well. So you do have a lot of flexibility in how you support your attacks. And of course, you also have a sniper activation of 6, which means it's fairly average on the bell curve for dice rolls, so you're probably going to see a lot of snipers, and hopefully you can start whittling away the German leadership. Now, some disadvantages is, as always, is the lack of leaders in the Russian OB. You only have 1 to 8, and therefore you're going to have a lot of squads that will not have leaders, which means you're going to have to set up rally points for when they break so they can fall back to a leader and help them get them back into the fight quickly as possible. You're really hurting on support weapons in comparison to the Germans. You've only got 3 mediums and 7 lights with 1 heavy, as opposed to all the German firepower. And again, because of your dispersed setup, it's very hard to support each other with these huge kill stacks. You have radialist AFV in the form of those T-34 M41s, which means they must move as a platoon, sharing costs, and they're going to be much more difficult to maneuver around in a city. You're probably going to have at least 1 tank that may not even have anything to shoot at because of positioning with the other 2, given the restrictions of platoon movement. And then there's the optional scenario SSR number 5, where you have the 3-to-1 ratio requirement of unbroken Russian squads to Germans, which since you start at almost 1 to 2 seemed very achievable. However, if the Germans make a last-ditch push, they have a lot of resources, and you lose a lot of units, you might not have the numbers you need to secure a victory, or even turn a draw into a loss because of that. One last thing I forgot to mention was the fact that concealment for the Russians. Now, in the factory building, you do have 18 concealment counters. So if we look at the factory again, we're looking at what, 3, 4, 7, 9 hexes. So you can have at least 2 concealment in each hex. You can have concealed units in all your hexes. What it's going to look like is you're probably going to have a couple of concealed stacks, maybe these ones up front, while the rest of them are going to be real units. And this way the German will spend a turn firing at dummy stacks. The fallback, of course, is if these hexes are vacated because they're dummy stacks, it's much easier for him to jump in. Right, so let's get into the ACOCA factors. This is a military geointelligence tool that's used to break up the battle space into manageable chunks, and it helps identify certain features that you as a commander may miss at first glance. So let's get into those. They consist of the 5 you can see there, observation fields of fire we're going to cover first. Now, when it comes to that, again, we have plenty of level 2 buildings in play. Most of these are level 2. The factory as well. However, again, there's no upper floors or roof at top in play, just ground floor. But there are a lot of level 2 buildings, most of which are controlled by the Germans. With the exception of this one here and this one here. All the other, well, this one here as well. All the other ones are going to be German controlled. And therefore, they're definitely going to have a height advantage when it comes to observation. A fire base up in one of these hexes here from the Germans will help keep a lot of the 527s in check. So it's going to make their life a little harder trying to get closer to support attacks into the factory. You're going to have a lot of fire lanes down the road. Again, this is a German position here, so right this way, you pretty well cut off any east-west movement. Again, with this guy over here, you can do the same. So it helps to isolate the Russians. However, they're going to have to suppress your fire bases in order for you to in order for them to keep moving. And of course, it works both ways. This is a Russian MG here, which is going to do a good job of doing any interdiction along this area. And of course, you've got your 527 Carpeted Doom setting up in this area here, which again will give you lots of observation and fields of fire from that. Given the density of the terrain, there's going to be lots of point-blank fire, so that doubles your firepower. Remember the adjacency rules. If it's 2 levels higher than you, they'll get point-blank fire, you will not. So just remember that. So if you're, for example, have a squad here in the streets, and there's a squad up here on a 2nd level, this guy gets adjacency, this guy does not. So it's going to be plenty of that going on, maybe even triple point-blank fire if you got a human wave as you enter locations. Sniper activation number of 6 is going to be the big unknown. It's going to be floating around the battle space. It's going to be kicking you. The one good advantage for the Russians is this interior building hex, which is a good spot also for the Russian heavy and a leader. This will be your collection rally point for your broken units, is immune to sniper fire because it's interior building hex. So that's a great vantage point for your leader, while your other forces are set up in the surrounding area, keeping those Germans out. Once they penetrate the walls, you have almost point-blank shots with a lot of firepower. I had the medium and the heavy with 2 squads. You're looking out in the 40s for firepower, which is just deadly when you're probably going to look at non-assault movement in a factory. So that's going to eliminate the +1, which means you're looking at a flat 0 on the 36 table. Could be quite lethal for the Germans to actually enter this location. Regarding snipers, you also want to avoid low firepower shots because those are just sniper baits. Now, typically, what we're talking about is fire that's in the 2, 4, maybe even the 6 range. If you start adding in modifiers, you're much more likely to get this 6 result. And it may not be worthwhile to take the shot, especially if you're on the 2 and the 4 column. Again, because of the +3 modifier to most shots, you want to avoid those low power ones because you're just going to attract a sniper. And of course, one firepower with +3 or even +2 is almost useless. You can use those when their troops are moving on the road, but try and avoid those low firepower attacks if possible to avoid being hit by a sniper. You want to make your shots count. All right, moving on to cover and concealment. Again, we have plenty of stone buildings. They offer a +3 TM. The factory is not fortified, so no extra bonus there. Fanaticism is enough. And you're going to be able to dash from building to building because while there is plenty of lines of fire, like, again, we have Germans in this building, so you can do this. You can do this. You have limited options once they get into the dead space, and once these have become neutralized, then of course you have freedom of movement to go, because even a fire base up here with all the elevation buildings is not going to be able to see a lot of movement in the left, and vice versa. So Russians really have to secure a couple of key strong points to prevent the Russian or German fire bases from mauling their forces as they move around. As a result, there's going to be many covered approaches, except for when you get to the buildings. So you can come from east to west, or west to east, I should say, like this. But once you get into this front line here, then you're still going to have to brave the roads to secure buildings. Then you're going to have to get into the factory, which is probably going to be German-owned, and try and kick them out. So you're going to have to do some covering fire while you move around the buildings. And the trade-off, again, is concealment versus speed. If you're concealed, you must use assault movement to move, which obviously limits how far you can move. You're going to basically move in 2-step chunks if you want to keep your concealment, which, given 7 game turns, might not be advantageous to you. So there may not be a lot of concealment going on initially. It's going to be near the end game when you got to be a little bit more cautious, especially as a Russian, where you have to try and keep alive to get that 3-to-1 ratio, where you're going to be skulking back to gain concealment, push those guys forward again if you want to. Again, the center hex right here is a good spot for the 9-1 and the HMG, 9-2 and the HMG. Throw in another squad with the medium, and like I said, that's a lot of firepower sitting in the central hex, and anytime a German crosses over, you're just blasting him point blank in the face with 36 firepower. And typically it's either going to be a -1, maybe a flat, depending on what's going on. You're probably going to get a negative modifier on a 36 table. So it's very hard for the Germans to break this center stack until they can bring in armor. You send in a vehicle through there, and then it may not be so effective because of the inability to fire outside your hex, assuming they don't kill it. And then you'll fall down. But until that point, this is a very strong point for the Russians to sit up in. And again, because of that, you're also immune to the sniper, which will be doing quite the number on you. Obstacles, for the same reason why you have lots of cover, you're also going to have a lot of obstacles to your objectives. The buildings. Most of them are going to be +3. There are some woods and some +2 buildings, but most of this is going to be stone, +3 TM, and it's going to be difficult to negotiate those fire lanes that are going to be put up by both sides. Transitioning east to west is going to be more or less applicable to the Russians. Germans less so, because you're going to fight for your life on the west. You're going to have a decent fight for the factory on the right, so you're not going to be able to mutually support each other. And you have to secure one or the other before you can support the other one. So for the Russians, they have the flexibility, again, that 527 carpeted doom. They can swing east or they can swing west, supporting whatever they want. And they're much easier for them to maneuver around. Again, the factory is going to be a big obstacle to get into because the fanaticism, for one, and you're going to start off everything concealed. So it's going to take a lot to break and reveal the units in here before you start jumping in and trying to secure the factory. All right, so let's look at some key terrain. This is terrain that is vital to you as a player that you must secure in order to secure a win. So obviously we have the factory for one, and then we have these 5 German buildings, of which you must capture at least 2 more than the Russians lose. So the Russians have 5 as well, and the Germans have 5. Again, Germans are severely outnumbered in the west, and you're likely going to lose this one off the bat, although we could contend this one for 2 or 3 turns, depending on where you set up and luck. This building here will probably fall quite easily as well. This one is going to be cut off because you're going to have Russians in these 2 buildings here. And that really leaves this building to fight from for the Germans. So if the Germans can hold on to this at least, it gives them a toehold on the west side. Once this is secured, then we can start pushing our forces this way. Russians, again, for their part, because they have the luxury of setting up last with these guys, they can come either way. Again, like we discussed, they can push through these initial obstacles and push the Germans out. It's going to be quite easy for the Russians, I think, well, let's say fairly easy for the Russians to secure this scenario victory. Less so for this one because they're going to be more on the defensive, although they do have, again, this Carpet of Doom. So we have avenues of approach as our last Coca factor. And again, we have the carpet. So how you attack with these guys is going to be very important. This cluster in this building here is probably good for supporting attacks on these 2. Keeps this as a good fire lane because it prevents any movement to the north from the Germans, and it will help support attacks from the Russians into this building here. Again, once this building is secured, it really is a linchpin for the German defense. It's much easier, assuming these have not already been captured, to take these 3 buildings here. At the same time, you guys can start pushing in towards the east. You secure that block. These guys take this building. Again, because of the dispersed German setup, it should be quite easy. It's very difficult for them to mutually support each other, generally speaking, but it is possible, so you will have to be wary of that. German forces from the east, for their part, are going to be just attacking into the factory. And you may have a fire base up here or here just to help cover any approaches, keep these 527s from easily walking into the factory and supporting it. Now, Germans, for their part, again, have a much harder battle in the west. They have to hold on to, again, at least this one. This would be really nice to have. This, again, will probably be gone, but these 2, more than likely, are going to be swamped by Russians, and they'll probably fall by turn 3, maybe turn 4, again, depending on luck, where you set up, whether or not the Russian does a human wave, which is always possible, coming in right there, right at the start, with 12 628s. Very difficult to defeat all of them, and you don't have enough forces to take a lot of shots, but there will be a lot of residual fire they will have to walk through, and again, with luck, you might have a high attrition rate on your 628s. But you must hold on to a couple of these buildings at least. If you do, you can delay the turn of your armor, come on turn 4, and you can then support your efforts directly by having your tanks come on here, facing off against the Russian T-34s. So let's look at some general tactics. Again, using our Okoka factors here. So we have various setups for both sides, and then we have to conduct the attack. There's going to be 12 628s in this building with a 10-2. Again, you can set up 3 in these hexes on the ground floor and then do a human wave into this building. That's I think the human wave has fallen out of favor as a general rule. It's not the best way, especially because you're going to have 3 squads in this location with a 9-1 and an LMG. So it's going to be difficult to cross this road. Now, if you have a German LMG set up in this location, you can provide plenty of cover fire to help whittle down any kind of human wave. If the Russian sees this kind of setup with German units in the 4 and an LMG here, he may want to reconsider the human wave potential. If the Germans are all skulking back on the various floors of this hex here, then human wave might be better, just because it gives you that morale boost, gives you all a movement, and you're much easier to negotiate into this building. But human wave as a tactic is probably falling out of favor because this open area with a -2 moving, your +1 to your morale is really not going to be a benefit. There's a Russian MG in this building here, which is going to help suppress any German fire bases and support this attack. Meanwhile, you have Russian units in these buildings, which will probably be moving south, so they can leapfrog into that building there. So the way I generally see it is you're going to have a Russian attack coming this way. Eventually this will be isolated and cut off, especially with armor coming in. And again, that leaves this building really to fight over for the Germans, with your 527s helping to isolate this building here. So this one's gone. This one will be gone later on, as will these ones. This one here is probably the only one that you really have a chance of holding on to, but you're just going to get hordes and hordes of Russians coming in, whittling you away as a German. On the right side, again, you're going to have a lot of units in the factory. Everyone will be concealed, which means halves your firepower. It's going to be difficult to break this. If you have a good fire base up in here with the medium and the heavy, that's 20 firepower. You'll be on the 8, and you have a 10-2 leader with them. That's going to put it down to up 1 on the 8, which is not horrible. You're going to break a lot of concealment, but you're also going to have to waste a couple of turns of fire to neutralize these locations. What might be a good tactic for the German, if you have your 838s in here, yes, you have flamethrowers, but you can also deploy your 467s. So you have a couple of half squads, and you may want to wait to see who goes first. Again, something I failed to mention is once setup is complete, you dice to see who goes first. On 1 to 3, it's the Russians, and on a 4 to 6, it's the Germans. And if the Germans go second, then this tactic may not work. If, however, you're lucky enough to get the 4 to 6 and you go first, this might be a good tactic. You deploy a 467s into half squads. You send them in on their movement phase to bump into the concealment. It's a dummy stack. It will disappear. They'll be in the factory. If it's a unit, then you'll be pushed back into the street and you'll probably be decimated. But it's only a half squad. Meanwhile, the rest of your forces are set up on opportunity fire, which means they can use their full firepower in the advance phase. Now, with assault firing 838s, you don't have to necessarily do that. You can move them into the street using assault movement. Throw a smoke grenade, you assault move into the street, so you're adjacent. And this way you are next to the building should there be Russian units located there. And then, of course, you could advance into the building. So if you win the die toss, this might be a viable option. Excuse me. Again, you send in half squads to rip concealment off, while your fire base in the back is on op fire, ready to mow them down, and then you push in with your engineers. For the Germans, this will be quite easy to attain, to get into. Holding it is going to be very difficult because, again, you're going to have a uber stack sitting here, which is just going to decimate anything that comes in anyways. So this is a good spot for the 10-3. If you get a 4-check, for example, with the 10-3 and he passes, it's only going to be a 1-check. And 838s should be passing most of those. So if you can survive enough to get in here, throw a DC, maybe use a flamethrower, it's going to improve your chances of taking the building. That's what happened with Dave and I when we played. The building was taken by turn 4, I think it was. I just sent in half squad with a DC. There's another squad with a DC. You throw a couple of those, do some morale checks, some pins. You start breaking these guys, and then you're pushing them out to the extremities. And once they see German units in these locations, they cannot retreat any further this way. They must be pushed south. If you see a German this way, that means you're basically going to failure to rout them, because these two locations have no other place to go to. There's no upper floors in the factory. So if the Germans can push through, start whittling away to defenses and push them back to the west, they're going to have nowhere to go. Of course, the caveat to that is you must still have German units in this building and in this building down here. So German forces in these three are going to have a two-way battle. You're going to have pressure from the west, and you're going to have probably a couple of shots coming in this way, although the Russian may want to keep his concealment. For the Russians, you must probably get rid of this building, secure it as quickly as possible, because Once you do that, you have good routes for your 527s to assault the factory and help secure that victory. Armor. Bringing on the armor. Again, because you're limited with platoon movement for the M41s, you're probably going to set up something like this, maybe to help deal with this. Maybe they'll come this way here. They help deal with this building. That's what happened with Dave. He had his 3 tanks like this, and they just blasted my fire base that was up here. Only thing left was the medium. And I only had a squad which survived a lot of close combat rounds. Was very lucky. Ended up winning a close combat round before it was finally wiped out, almost from the get-go. There must have been three game turns of close combat that went on in this hex. They were just unable to kill each other, and then of course they were finally overwhelmed. But having the armor blast the fire base off the second floor greatly hindered the efforts to secure this building. The T-34 M43 is your tank killer. You may want to bring it along the north road, something like this, because you're probably going to see armor, German armor in this location eventually, maybe back here, something like this. Depending on how the battle shapes up, you don't want to deploy your German armor forward until you can be supported by the infantry, which just makes sense. So the T-34 might be a good spot for one of these 3 hexes to basically limit German armor movement. Yes, it's a 76 long, but again, it's only a 13. And once the 3 Gs come on with their 8 armor, then it's going to be that much more difficult to secure a kill. You do have APCR, but it's only depletion number 4, so it's not the greatest. And it's only one of those M43s, so it's going to be much harder to deal with 5 tanks if you're by yourself. But mutually supported with infantry, at least you're not going to get jumped on in close combat. German armor for their part, again, you have 2 entry points, this one and this one here. Or you delay and then you can come anywhere along the south or the east. Initial efforts will obviously be moving something like this to secure the factory. Maybe have to send in one of these to deal with that central fire base. Again, if you do, I would go through the factory door because it's only a +1 for move. And yes, it's a bog check, but it's you have normal pressure, which is a +1, and it's a factory, which is a +2 total. So anything 9 or less, and you're fine to go through it. So assuming you're in this factory with an AFE, you can then try an overrun. If your tank lives, it will prevent anything that's in the center hex from firing out, which makes it easier for you to assault in. Your other tanks, again, are going to be taking up various vantage points to help secure your victory and whittle away the Russian defenses. This is the way it worked for us. This is exactly the setup we had. I initially had my 3 76 long 3Gs in this location, like an all-around defense, while the German armor or Russian armor was sitting right here, and the other 3 were dealing with the building. So I was able to provide enough targets for this guy to miss. He ended up breaking his gun, which was huge. Dave had a really bad run of 12s and 11s and 10s in turns 5 and 6. Broke a lot of his guns. He lost 2 tanks to recall because of failed repair attempts, which is something else to consider when it comes to repair attempts. If your main gun malfunctions, now you already have limited armor, you don't want to necessarily risk repairing your gun if it means losing it. You still got machine guns. They have a 4 coax and a 2 BMG, so that's quite powerful for machine gun use. Yes, they're +3 buildings, but if your main gun malfs, you want to really decide, do I need to roll for repair of the barrel? Because if I roll a 6, it's going to get recalled. And again, the Russian armor, while there's only 4 of them, is definitely a help. So in Dave's case, he rolled poorly, and 2 of the 4 tanks got recalled. So that's not a great start. I think that's about it. The rest of it's going to be basically how the battle fares. So once more, if this is going well for the Russians, Germans, obviously you cannot support this. You may want to waste your effort, not waste. You may want to use your efforts to secure the factory Once you gain that with your armor, maybe you can start a push to the west, start taking these buildings here, and thereby increase the number of German buildings that he must capture. But it's going to be very difficult to, I think, to do that. Generally speaking, there's going to be a lot of units. You're going to have 628s probably reaching this building through the nice circuitous route. You're going to have a lot of 447s, and then again, you're going to have your 527s. All that you're going to have to punch through in order to secure the victory. So I'm actually surprised that there's not more draws, but I have a feeling that many people are going to be using that SSR. That means that the Russians must have that 3-to-1 ratio to win. And again, probably the biggest RG factor is who goes first. If the Germans go first, with all their firepower, they have a good chance of breaking a lot of Russians. They have a good chance of starting their assault on the factory a little bit earlier. If they go second, the Germans have a much harder battle because, again, 12 628s will just sweep through this building. And 527s are going to do a good number of the forward German positions and with their assault fire. So it's going to be very difficult for the Germans to defend everywhere when the Russians go first. So if you're lucky enough to get the die roll, you're definitely going to have an advantage as in a German over the Russian. I think that's about it that I'll cover for this scenario. It's already going on long enough. This is a really awesome scenario. For one, it's all on one map board. It's going to use up a lot of counters. Make sure you have a lot of prisoner counters because there will be a plenty. Again, you have to decide at what point do you invoke no quarter, if you do, just so that you don't have to take any more prisoners. You need them because if you invoke no quarter, you cannot do mopping up. And because the game is about building control, mopping up might be critical. It could save you a turn, maybe two, of having to manually clear out a building. You can just declare it and secure the building in one fire phase, provided, of course, you follow the rules for mopping up. And there we go. So that's an initial recce. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Again, this is supposed to be an initial impression of a scenario, maybe having played it once or twice. Dave and I have done Scenario A several times. B, I don't think we've done, maybe once or twice. And as you can see from the scenario archive stats, it's one of the lesser played of the three. And then, of course, we're tackling C, which combines A and B together. So it's a very dense scenario, lots of counters, a lot of rules that you have to know how to move, how to fire, what you can shoot at, what you can't shoot at. LOS is going to be huge. Never even talked about line of sight blockage. It's, again, something that I seem to have difficulty grasping is the line of sight rules. For some reason, I just, the way that it's worded in the rule book, it just, it's sometimes hard to grasp. Maybe I'll have to do a video on LOS to help explain that. But again, this video is going on long enough. Let me know what you guys think of the scenarios, A, B, and C. Remember, you can get them from MMP's website. It's under digital products, I believe, ASL support. And from there, you can find the classic scenarios. And then, like I said, there's about 13 of them or so, all lettered. That came out in the original General magazine. And they've all been updated for the latest rules and such. So if you've played them, let me know in the comments what you thought, what worked for you, and what didn't work for you. Okay, all right. And if I missed anything, make sure you let me know, and I can always do a follow-up video and cover those points as well. See you guys next video. Bye-bye.